Today, I'm going to tell you 3 stories about people who did things they should not have done. And then also, I'm going to show you the insane lengths they went to try to cover up what they did. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the like button an ice cream sundae. But instead of using cherry sauce, go ahead and douse it in ketchup. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the afternoon of December 1st, 1999, a middle-aged man named Li Hao was standing in the back office of a small restaurant in Decheng County, which is in southwestern China, when he suddenly heard somebody yelling in the seating area. They were screaming for the manager, and that was Li. So he hurried out of the office to see what was going on. When he rounded the corner into the seating area, Li immediately saw this customer sitting at a table with a plate of food in front of him, and he was slamming his fists against the table over and over again, and he was screaming that his food tasted so disgusting that even pigs wouldn't eat it. And hearing this, Li felt totally exhausted and overwhelmed, because this was literally the 10th time today that a customer of his had complained about the food tasting bad. In fact, there had been so many complaints back to back to back that Li hadn't even had time to speak to the chef and figure out what was going on here. And so Li walked over to the customer's table and he bowed to show respect, and then he said he was so sorry for the inconvenience and told the man that his meal was on the house. When the door slammed shut behind him, Li kind of just looked around the restaurant and he realized that his normally very busy restaurant was actually now completely deserted. And so Li was totally frustrated and he just turned around, he marched to the back of the restaurant and he flung open the door that led to the kitchen. And right inside, he saw the chef standing at the counter, cutting up some vegetables. And Li, by this point, was just so mad and frankly so worried about what was happening to his restaurant that when he got in there, he just started yelling at the chef. He told the chef that he better have a really good explanation for why everything he cooked that day had tasted so horrible. Otherwise, he was getting fired. But the chef immediately set his knife down and just put his hands up and was like, look, it's not my fault. He said he had also noticed that the food tasted really weird, but he didn't know why. All of his ingredients were fresh. He hadn't changed any of his recipes, like he didn't get it. However, the chef said he had talked to some other chefs who worked at different restaurants in the area, and they were saying the same thing, that people are saying their food tastes bad and they don't know why. So the chef said, like, whatever's going on here, it's affecting everybody. And so the next morning, Li met up with a bunch of these other restaurant managers in the neighborhood to talk about the problems that they were all having with their food. And very quickly, he realized, 1, it was true that these other restaurants were having this same issue. And 2, they all learned that they were all sourcing one ingredient from the same place. And so they all figured that it was this ingredient that was the problem. And they needed to get together and call the supplier and figure out what was wrong. Later that same day, a man named Yang Guishou walked along a rugged dirt path up a steep hill not far from the restaurant that Li managed. Yang worked for the supplier that Li and the other restaurant managers had called. And now he was going to inspect this ingredient that they thought was making all of their food taste bad. And Yang admittedly really wasn't sure what to expect. The supplier he worked for didn't usually get any complaints, and the specific ingredient that these restaurant managers were worried about was normally very good. But Yang did think it was possible that maybe the ingredient could have been tainted somehow. Maybe because rats had gotten into the building where they stored it or something. So Yang hiked to the top of the hill where there was a tall concrete storage building. He climbed up a rusty metal ladder to the top of the building and then opened up a door and went inside. It was dark inside, which he expected, so he pulled out his flashlight and he turned it on. And he sort of expected to maybe see some rats, but when he looked around, he didn't see any. However, he did see something. Right beyond where he was standing, basically right inside this room, there was this large canvas bag that definitely should not have been in there. And so Yang, he just reached out instinctively and began to poke the bag. and something fell out of it. And for a second, Yang couldn't even process what he was seeing. But then, all at once, he understood, and suddenly everything made sense. He scrambled out of the building, went down the ladder, and ran to go call the police. It would turn out the ingredient that all the restaurants had in common was their water. And so when Yang went into the water tower and saw that canvas bag, well, what came rolling out of it was a decomposing human head, which meant for 2 full weeks, every restaurant nearby had been cooking their food with water that was tainted by a rotting corpse. The police would later determine that the body belonged to a man from another town who had been robbed and killed by 3 members of an organized crime group. Those 3 men were found, they were arrested, found guilty, and sentenced to death. Everyday life is full of moments that you plan for, and also moments that just happen, often when you least expect them. Whether it's part of your normal routine or something unexpected, Amazon is where you go for everyday essentials, making shopping simple and dependable. From running out of household basics to last-minute surprises, Amazon's great deals and low prices on everyday essentials make it easier to handle whatever life throws your way. Everything is in one place, so there's no extra stress or jumping through hoops when time is already tight. Whether it's something you buy regularly or something you suddenly realize you need right now, Amazon makes it easy to find what you're looking for quickly and at a price that feels good. It's straightforward, dependable shopping that makes everyday moments feel more manageable with less stress, fewer steps, and more confidence that your money is well spent. Shop Amazon and save on essentials. Save the everyday. On the evening of March 5th, 1958, a 22-year-old man named Qasim bin Osman was eating dinner inside of his home in a small town in modern-day Malaysia when he suddenly heard somebody frantically pounding at his front door. Qasim was not expecting any guests, but he also wasn't really surprised by the noise, because Qasim was something called a bomo, which was basically like a shaman. He was very well known and highly respected in town, and so it was not unusual for people to show up at his house sort of unexpectedly, asking for help with various spiritual problems. So Qasim got up and he went to answer the door. And when he did, he saw 4 men standing on his porch, and he vaguely recognized them like he'd seen them around town before. One of the men introduced himself as Kor Agwan, and Kor said he needed Qasim's help because last night his wife had gone missing. He'd spent all day searching and still couldn't find her, and so he hoped that maybe Qasim could help. And when he heard this, Qasim felt a little bit uncomfortable. Generally speaking, he was very confident in his abilities as a healer, which was primarily what he did. He was like a spiritual healer. But he'd never helped find a missing person before. So Qasim was honest and told Kor that he really didn't know if he could help, but he would try. And so Qasim invited all 4 men into his home, into his living room, and then while they were sitting down, he went into his supply room and he grabbed some matches and this large bowl that was filled with charcoal, and then with these supplies, he went back and met the group. Qasim then instructed everybody to sit in a circle on the floor. He explained that he was going to do a meditation ritual that was meant to help him clear his mind so he could tap into the energies around him. Ideally, he said, he would be able, through this process, to connect to Kor's wife's energy so he could maybe find her. And so the group, after sitting down and sort of understanding the instructions, Qasim, he struck a match and then lit the charcoal on fire that was in this bowl. Then Qasim actually leaned his head over this, smoldering bowl of charcoal and began taking in these huge breaths of smoke. And he kept inhaling the smoke until he felt so lightheaded that he was about to pass out, and right as he's on the verge of losing consciousness, an image flashed through his mind. For a split second, what he saw was this light green field that seemed to extend, into infinity, just a massive green field. And so at this point, Qasim, he snapped his head back, stopped breathing in all the smoke, and he told Kor and the other men that he knew where they needed to go. About 15 minutes later, Qasim, Kor, and the other men walked into a light green field that was identical to the one Qasim had seen in his mind. It was a huge rice paddy right on the edge of town. And so when they got to this rice paddy, they split up and just began looking for, I guess, clues or maybe for Kaur's wife. They didn't even know. And very quickly, one of the men yells out that he's found something. And so Qasim and Kaur and the others, they join this guy and they look down and they see there's like this pile of straw that's covering something pretty sizable in the rice paddy. Eventually, one of the men reached down and began removing the straw, and at the base of it, underneath this big pile, was Kaur's wife, and she was covered in blood, and she was dead. About 30 minutes later, a police officer named J.C. Sabui sat inside of an interview room at the police station with Kaur, the dead woman's husband. By this point, Sabui had been briefed on the details of this case. He knew that Kaur's wife had gone missing about 24 hours earlier, that the town Bomo had apparently had this vision that led them to the rice paddy where her body was found, and that officers had actually already determined that she'd been beaten to death. Now, Sabui was trying to hone in on potential suspects, and the victim's husband was the most obvious place to start. So Sabui asked Kaur to tell him more about the circumstances around his wife's disappearance. Kaur explained that the night before she had left on her own to go for a late night walk and never came home. He said he didn't know of anybody who would have wanted to hurt her, but he did have a theory about her murder. He said his wife normally wore a lot of jewelry, but when he'd seen her body in the rice paddy, he'd noticed all of her jewelry was gone. So he wondered if maybe she'd been robbed. Sabui thought the idea that this woman just went on a random nighttime walk by herself right before she went missing and turned up dead, it just seemed sort of unlikely. And it also seemed like Kaur was just really eager to throw suspicion off of himself. But the robbery angle also did sound plausible. I mean, turning up with no jewelry on when she normally wore jewelry suggests a robbery. So Sabui decided to follow up both on the husband and the robbery angle. And he and his team would spend the next 4 days searching for evidence against Kaur and for this missing jewelry. But they came up totally empty. And so 96 hours into this investigation, they basically had nothing to show for it. And so as a result, he sort of felt desperate. And even though he didn't normally believe in the town Bomo's visions or magic, he felt like, it was one of his visions that led to this body. Maybe he actually is as good as he says he is. Why don't we ask him what he thinks? On the morning of March 9th, so this is 4 days after Kaur's wife's body was found, Sabui knocked on the town Bomo's front door. And when Qasim answered, Sabui explained the situation about how, there was missing jewelry and maybe it was a robbery and they didn't know what. And they asked if Qasim would be willing to help, since, after all, he had already found the body. Now, Qasim was not particularly eager to be a part of this investigation. He openly said, I don't solve crimes. I'm a spiritual healer. But, he had to admit that he's already gotten involved. He's the one whose vision led to the finding of the body, and so he told Sabui that, of course, he would try. So Sabui watched as Qasim left the door and went into his house and then came back with a bowl of charcoal. And before long, Qasim had lit it on fire and was deeply inhaling the fumes coming off of it. And after a minute or two, when Qasim was totally messed up from breathing in all this smoke, he looked up and he said he's had another vision. And so he jumped up, he left his house and began walking down the street. And Sabui just followed right behind him. And Sabui watched as Qasim would stop in front of each house, and for a few moments he would just stare at the house. And then eventually he would just move on to the next one. Qasim looped all around town, just stopping and staring at all these houses for literally hours. And to Sabui, he was starting to feel like it was a mistake to bring Qasim in, because it just seemed like this isn't going anywhere. His ability to find the body happened pretty much right away. What is this? What is he doing? However, out of nowhere, Qasim stopped in front of yet another house, stared at it for a second, and then turned and told Sabui, this is where the jewelry is. And this actually made Sabui feel very intrigued. Because of all the houses that he thought Qasim might eventually stop in front of and suggest there was some clue inside, let alone the jewelry inside, this particular house had never entered Sabui's mind. So given the weirdness of where they now were standing, Sabui called for backup. And then he and a team of officers searched this house. And lo and behold, they found Kaur's wife's missing jewelry inside, just like Qasim had said. And so despite Sabui's, growing skepticism around what Qasim can actually do, this was now the second time that Qasim had sort of had this big breakthrough in the case from his visions. Like, that was incredible. But the problem was the house that Qasim had led them to, where the jewelry was Qasim's own house. It would turn out Kaur's wife really did go on a walk by herself on the night she disappeared. But during that walk, she passed by Qasim's house. And when she did, Qasim attacked and killed her and then stole her jewelry and hid her body in the rice paddy. Apparently, he thought pretending to help with the investigation would make him look innocent. But the police quickly realized he wasn't magical, he was just guilty. After his arrest, Qasim would give a full confession, and he was ultimately convicted of murder and sentenced to death. At 8 a.m. on August 22, 1974, a young man named Liu Feng sat on a long bench inside of a public mortuary in Hong Kong. He was sitting with about a dozen of his closest family members, and they were all facing the front of the room, looking at an open wooden coffin. Inside of the coffin was the body of Feng's older sister, 34-year-old Liu Fumin. Today was her funeral, and it was supposed to be a time for Feng and his family to come together and privately mourn their loss. But they couldn't do that because they were literally outnumbered by the amount of newspaper reporters who were also in the room. And the reporters were milling around, taking notes, and even taking pictures of the body in the coffin. And this really upset Feng, because in his mind, the reporters were not treating his sister like a person. They were treating her like, the salacious headline she'd become ever since her death. So 1 week earlier, Feng's sister, Fumin, had been found strangled to death in a hotel room in Hong Kong. She had clearly been murdered. But that was not what had made her case such big news. What had made it news was the fact that Fumin had been found without her face. Her killer had cut off her eyebrows, her eyelids, her nose, and her lips. And so now, as she lay in her open coffin, she looked grotesque. Since she didn't have eyelids, it looked like she was staring straight up at the ceiling with these huge glassy eyes, and without lips, it looked like she was baring her teeth in this horrible, morbid smile. But for Feng and probably the rest of his family, the worst part of all of this was not even, the media attention. It was the police response. They hadn't arrested anyone for the crime yet. His sister's murder was still unsolved. And so as Feng is watching these reporters mill about, treating his sister like she's just some, freak show, and he's thinking about how disrespectful her killer was to her body and how the police seemed so incompetent, it made him just so mad. But there was one thing that did bring him comfort, and that was the fact that he had actually come up with a plan that he believed would help him solve his sister's murder. And today, he was going to put that plan into action. Feng sat quietly with his family throughout the funeral service and tried his best to ignore the reporters. And then finally, when it was time for everybody to say their final goodbyes to his sister, Feng walked up to the front of the room, he reached into the pocket of his jacket, and he pulled out a giant knife. The next evening, on August 23rd, a police officer was doing her regular nighttime patrol through a neighborhood in Hong Kong that was not very far from where Liu Fumin's funeral had been held the day before. And as this policewoman was walking along, she glanced down an alleyway and she saw something that made her immediately stop in her tracks. There was a guy who was just laying on the ground, basically laying in this limp heap. And when she walked up to him, she could see there was blood all over him, and some of his limbs were twisted and contorted and obviously broken. He looked like he had fallen from a great height. The policewoman immediately called an ambulance and then ran to the man's side. And sort of unbelievably, she found he was still alive. And so she asked him what happened. And the guy, who was obviously in pain, he just kind of looked up towards the building right next to them. And as he's looking up, he said a woman had pushed him. When more officers arrived on the scene, they went to search for this woman who apparently was up on the roof. But there was no evidence of a woman or any kind of struggle at all anywhere on the top of the building or in the top floors of the building. There just was no sign that anything had happened. It was not until the police went to the hospital and re-interviewed the injured man, and he gave them a fuller statement about exactly who this woman was, that they understood why. It all had to do with Liu Feng, the brother of the murdered woman, and what he had done with that knife at her funeral. So when the injured man sort of came to in the hospital and he had stabilized a little bit and the police showed up and asked him to give more information about who pushed him off the roof, this was his description of the woman who pushed him. He said she had these big, horrible, glassy eyes and this awful, toothy grin, and she had no eyebrows, she had no eyelids, her nose was gone, her lips were gone. She looked horrifying. Obviously, he was basically describing the murdered woman, Liu Fumin, but she was dead, like literally dead when he got pushed off the roof. And so the police are like, that's not possible. A dead woman could not have pushed you off the roof. But wait, her brother, the murdered victim's brother, Liu Feng, at the funeral when he pulled out that knife, he then went on to perform this ancient Taoist ritual where he stabbed the knife into his sister's wooden coffin, which he believed would unleash her spirit so it could go find and take revenge on her killer. And apparently it worked, because the man in the alleyway, after describing effectively the ghost of this murdered woman, then gave a full confession saying he was her killer. He would say that the reason he did it is because she... Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.